The governance model that worked at 300 users is a liability at 3,000. In earlier videos in this series, we covered what the Power Platform Admin Center governance configuration requires. This video covers what changes in that architecture when the platform crosses 3,000 users. Not more of the same problems, but categorically different ones. Power Platform governance that works at 300 users is governance that has not yet been tested. At 300 users, flows running under personal accounts go unnoticed because the failure surface is small. At 3,000 users, a personal account running a business-critical flow is an operational dependency on an individual's employment status that affects a significant portion of the organization when that person leaves. The scale threshold changes which risks are acceptable, not just how many times they occur. 4 architectural thresholds change when Power Platform crosses 3,000 users. Each requires a design decision that was optional before and is not optional after. First, environment strategy. At 300 users, running development, test, and production workloads in a single default environment creates manageable friction. At 3,000 users, it creates a production environment where developers are actively modifying flows and apps that other users are actively running. A flow that breaks during a developer's test run is a business process failure for the 200 users who depend on it. The minimum at enterprise scale, a locked-down production environment, a development environment where builds happen, and a test environment where validation happens before promotion. At 3,000 users, this is an architectural requirement, not a best practice recommendation. Second, API and connector call volume. Power Platform connectors are subject to daily API call limits. At 300 users, the organization stays well inside those limits. At 3,000 users, flows that trigger on every item creation in a busy SharePoint list can exhaust connector limits before the end of the business day. When API limits are hit, flows stop running. Business processes that depend on them stop executing. No error is surfaced to the end user. The architecture question at scale is, which flows are at risk? What is the API call rate per user per day? And what is the headroom between the current rate and the platform limits? Third, DLP policy enforcement. DLP policies control which connectors can be used together. At 300 users with primarily IT-managed automation, DLP gaps are caught in review. At 3,000 users with business user makers, a DLP gap is a connector combination that any of 3,000 users can exploit to route data from a business system to an unauthorized external service. The enforcement model at enterprise scale requires DLP policies applied at the environment level, not as guidelines makers are expected to follow voluntarily. Fourth, maker access governance. At 300 users, allowing any licensed user to create flows and apps in the default environment is manageable through informal review. At 3,000 users, uncontrolled maker access produces hundreds of unreviewed automations operating on business data. The architecture at scale separates maker access from user access. End users access apps and flows promoted to production. Makers build in the development environment under a defined process. Maker status is granted based on demonstrated need and governance training, not by default on license assignment. Environment separation, API capacity planning, DLP enforcement, controlled maker access. 4 thresholds. All of them represent architectural decisions that were optional at 300 users and are required at 3,000. The right time to design for scale is not when the platform reaches it. Retrofitting environment strategy and DLP policies onto a 3,000 user environment with hundreds of existing flows is a significantly larger project than designing it correctly while the user base is still small enough to absorb the change. In the next video in this series, we go deeper on the specific admin center configuration areas that constitute enterprise governance.